The guest that we have today is somebody from the world of sport and law, somebody who combines these two in a unique mix.
Sport really has a significant role to play in building a nation, building community, building an individual as well. So all of those things are happening at the same time. And
at Go Sports.
Yeah. So my ism is sportsism.
Sportsism. Okay. Sportsism.
Right. If sport drives you, it also empowers you to look at the outcomes you are seeking and putting in place the processes that you need to get there. Right. So sportism is that attitude of seeing a destination and doing what you can to get there.
But I want to start off with what happened with Vinesh and sports and law.
What happened on the days of the Olympic sort of qualifiers and the final is the product of a lot of things that have happened till then, right? So, should she have been participating in the 50 kg category? The answer is probably no. Was that her first choice? The answer is no. But there have been a series of events that have got her to here, and the policing is not from the rules of sport. The policing is the outcome of certain interactions she's had with power and the consequences of that.
There was a time when Virat Kohli played for BCCI.
That was the argument made.
That was the argument made. That was the principle. The principle was that Virat Kohli,
it's a private body.
It's a private body. This player is playing for that private body, not for India.
And that as a result of that, the private body is only accountable to its own members. While these are private bodies, and there's a recognition there's private bodies for a good reason, autonomy, they exercise a public function.
Yeah.
So the accountability to the public has now been established in law unambiguously. There's been a line of cases, but this recent 5-6 years has actually changed the face of the way we have to look at sports governance and the place it occupies in our public domain.
When you talk about sport as a public good, can you imagine it in terms of as an extension of roti, kapda, makan, and sport as an essential public good that the government is supposed to distribute?
It's a few playing on behalf of all of us. Yeah. So conceptually, we all have the ability to play and join this pyramid, and anyone can be a footballer, right? If you wanted to be, you just have not had the motivation would be the argument. I would argue you may not have even had the opportunity, but your 11 that play on the field as the Indian national football team are playing on behalf of all of us. So there's only 11 spots there. But sport is not naturally that. Sport is anyone should have the right and ability to play. So can you also have sport as public good?
So if I wanted to be a cricketer, the first thing I need is a cricket net, right? I need either a cement surface and or a turf surface, a mat, an entire arena to play this thing. And the only place which has an arena is a paid arena. You can pay by the hour, join an academy. There is no way for me to access the sport.
What I would love to see much more is multi-use facilities where it's just a surface, and people get to choose what they play. Now, who am I to decide someone should play football? And the minute you build structure and you put 2 goals and you can play only one sport, you've actually taken away the autonomy of the user. So you've actually overlaid a structure when maybe structure was not required, all you needed was space. When you build permission to a structure, people enter based on someone else's acceptance of you inside the club.
And that someone else is who?
It could be a sports governing body. It could be a club secretary saying, I'll select you or I won't. And there you see the distinct difference in the evolution of what you would call hardball cricket and tennis ball cricket. So the large builders of Bangalore, are they going to open up their play fields and allow people, and I use the term allow very actively.
Who are you to allow? It's such a frustrating thing to even conceive of. Who is that uncle?
Because you own it, right?
Yeah.
So as public commons. Yeah. And I don't think we're actually that familiar with this concept of a public commons, which actually everyone has rights and access to. But there's also
the river doesn't belong to anybody, the sky doesn't belong to anybody.
But what is first motivation?
The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
I have a dream.
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal,
And welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to yet another episode of What's Your Ism. Before I introduce you to our guest today, I just want to remind you, if you're watching this for the first time, What's Your Ism is a show about ideologies. And I think now we are nearing 20 episodes. We have covered a lot of ground. Please do go back and watch some of those older videos. We have interviewed Marxists, we have interviewed feminists, Ambedkarites. Some of them are not even from the political world. They talk about the politics of sport. And in fact, the guest that we have today is somebody from the world of sport and law, somebody who combines these two in a unique mix. Nandan Kamath, thank you so much for
Pleasure.
being here on What's Your Ism.
Happy to be on the show.
And sorry, we are having it out here in the open. We were supposed to have this actually indoors, and well, it was too hot, and we don't have an AC studio, so we're having it out here outside in the office, outside the office of TNM. I hope you're comfortable.
Absolutely. I mean, talk about sport, do it in the outdoors. So.
All right, do it in the outdoors. And actually, in this show, we have people who have a theory of change often, right? A politician who believes that this ism is the way forward to change things around. And when we talk about changes and the desire for change, sports is an arena in which change is a cry out from the people who play sport. Everybody's talking about either corruption in sport or nepotism in sport. There is the actual pleasurable thing of either playing or watching, but then the whole game of running the sport, how the game is administered, is something that has always, I think, had a problem, in the way it's run, the way it's been administered. And your theory of change, allow me to summarize and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it can be addressed in two ways. One is with law as a tool to change and turn sports around and make it more accessible, make it more fair, and also to run institutes of excellence. Because you run, now tell me it's a profit or a non-profit, we'll discuss about it, but Go Sport, it's a national award-winning organization. You got an award called the Khel Protsahan Puraskar.
That's it.
Yeah, that's the award you got from the President of India for Go Sports, which is a sports mentorship organization.
Yeah. So essentially giving people opportunities to play through funding, support, mentorship. It's a large sort of scholarship program supported by CSR, and which gives people platforms on which to explore their talent and hopefully participate at international levels as well.
And it's a not-for-profit.
Yes, not-for-profit trust, aspiring Olympians, Paralympians, people aspiring to get better at sport and who need that the opportunity. So it's about getting talent to meet opportunity and then giving platforms for change. And we believe that sport really has a significant role to play in building a nation, building community, building an individual as well. So all of those things are happening at the same time. And
at Go Sports.
Yeah. So my ism is sportsism, if you can
sportsism.
call it.
Okay. Sportsism. So that's the thing. So there's this institution, and you believe that processes can be developed to develop an elite athlete. And then there is this aspect of you, which is that you're a lawyer. You studied at the law school in Bangalore. Then you went away to Oxford to study law.
That's right.
And then again over on to Harvard.
Yes.
And, it's a little intimidating, that resume of yours, that A-type personality that you have. So, which is that you played competitive cricket. You played Karnataka State for under 16, under 19, under 21 as well.
That's right, yes.
And you're a National Law School student at the same time. So, I mean, that's kind of intimidating. Before we get into the isms, I mean, is there a tip out there? How do you do this? I mean, how do you manage the two?
Yeah, actually, to be fair, I didn't really do both at the same time. So, I mean, they happened in serial order, not simultaneously. And actually, that's one of the things that's driven my.
But how does, sorry to interrupt you, but how does a guy who I read your book. Oh, by the way, the book you must pick up, it's called Boundary Lab. It's a book about sport and law at the surface, but it goes a lot deeper than that. We will discuss that. But in your book, you describe yourself as a young kid who would sleep with his bat, right? And you sleep with your bat, and you are also cracking an NLS entrance. How is that happening?
Yeah, so I mean, till I was about 16, 17, all I did was really play cricket, and I sort of got through my exams when I could.
Yeah.
I'd sort of cram between innings, and later on when I got back home, last 2 weeks before exams was where all of the action was. But sport was in many ways a starting point to the ways in which to engage with the world, and it's become a lens through which I see not only the way I engage with the world, but the sort of the patterns I see in the world at large in some sense. So while I was in school, cricket was my thing. I'd also played hockey at the school level, loved that sport. But there was a talent in cricket which came through simply from the opportunities I received. I developed early. I was tall, strong, and perhaps intimidating in a different way. I think all the batsmen used to say I was so much taller than them that when I came running into bowl, half the battle was already done before
you were
the ball.
A fast bowler?
I was when I was much younger. But also I batted. So I batted and that was actually my primary skill. So I played sport very intensely. It was really what gave me definition. As a young person, I was quite introverted, but sport was that outlet.
Right.
But at some point, that reckoning comes up, right? So you have to also figure out how to make a life at that point and a living. And I mean, I had a lot of privilege growing up. So it was not that I was ever at risk of not having a good life, but those choices come. And I'd finished school at St. Joseph's Boys High School. I was at St. Joseph's College of Commerce, which was really the factory for young cricketers. So I had Rahul Dravid 4 years ahead of me. There was a team filled with not only at college level, we had Ranji Trophy players, but people populating the team. I remember for the first time, I actually didn't even make the 11, which is almost inconceivable to me. So it was that strong a team. So I'd gone through that sort of route, but at the end of second PU, I was playing pretty serious cricket. But one of my friends was doing this National Law School entrance test, went off and did that. I did it a little bit on a lark. But,
you keep saying that on a lark. But you know, there are a lot of people who fail to do either with any degree of competence.
It was a simpler time. I don't think we had the hundreds of thousands of people who do this entrance test. I was always someone curious about the world, but also I loved logic, I loved pattern matching, and those things connect up now in a very different way, right? So the patterns that you see with numbers, with letters, I was always that, maybe a little bit of OCD components of, like if you see a number of a number plate on a car, you try and make some jumbling pattern. You see words, you try and do word plays. That was the type of young kid I was. I loved puzzles, I loved word play. I still do, but that entrance test had some of those elements of logic, general knowledge. So it was more like a puzzle for me. Again, as a sports person, you engaged with it as a contest, right? Even an entrance test.
Right.
So my friend was doing it. I went off and did it, and I came 15th in the entrance test. So then I sort of scratched my head and said, hey, I mean, if with that much effort I've got in, maybe there's something that is calling me, right? An aptitude or not. But I'd still not made the decision. Once you get in, it's not that you automatically go. And it was very much turning point of my life where my parents were, you make that choice, left the responsibility completely to me.
Right.
So as a 17, 18-year-old, making a big choice. But I go into the sort of the admission interview. After the exam, there's an interview. Not that it's going to decide whether you get in or not, but they want you to meet you before they admit you to the National Law School. And there we have the founder, Dr. Madhav Menon. So he's sitting in this big room with 7 or 8 other teachers. He asks some questions, very intimidating questions of what's wrong with India and how are you going, young man, how are you going to change it? All of that, I mean, I just made up some random answer. But at the end, he said, so at the end of the day, young man, are you going to be a cricketer or a lawyer? Because I'm telling you, you're not going to be both.
Right.
So that was like, okay, this is a big decision to be made. If I'm not going to be both, I have to choose one. It was a time where careers in sport were not significant. Maybe 5-6 people in the Indian cricket team actually made a good living. Maybe the bowlers struggled to even sort of buy a home or an apartment. It sounds absurd, but we're talking 1995 at that time. So I mean, I don't know if I can't remember if I thought a lot or I thought a little, but I made a decision to actually take up that seat at the National Law School. Left behind cricket for a while. I mean, I played at the National Law School, but very fleetingly, amateurishly. So it wasn't this cricket and law at the same time, but it was bringing for those 5 years of law school, bringing sort of the cricketing attitude to my educational experience. So I really took it on as it's almost like a sporting challenge, right? If sport drives you, it also empowers you to look at the outcomes you are seeking and putting in place the processes that you need to get there, right? So sportism is that attitude of seeing a destination and doing what you can to get there. And I was fortunate that the methods I used worked well. I did very well at National Law School. That got me a scholarship to Oxford. The Rhodes Scholarship, which has its own history and own challenges. And that took me to Harvard Law School, finished there. I worked for 3 years in California, worked in sort of technology law, corporate law. Then decided that my calling was here. So since 2006, I've been in Bangalore working on multiple projects. The thing that connects all of them is sport.
Yeah, so it is sports, law, sports again. And you've in the third cycle, you have figured out a way to combine the two. And now let's quickly, now that we have a sense of where you're coming from, how you came into this, let's get quickly into this theory of change, right? And right now, let's say, while we're having this interview will of course come out much later. The Olympics will be done by then. But this has been quite an Olympics. And we're having this discussion a day after what happened with Vinesh Phogat, right? So I had planned some other things and other topics to discuss in this interview, but I want to start off with what happened with Vinesh and sports and law, right? And in your book, Boundary Lab, you talk about law as a dynamic thing which responds to difference. How can law address difference? Now, very quickly, just after the Phogat incident, two of my colleagues pulled out this piece. Please check out this piece. It's by Bharti Singaravel and by Sukanya. They talk about how a woman's body is essentially different. And you cannot have this round peg, square hole kind of an approach where you have rules which are not appreciative of the fact that a woman's body responds very differently to things such as weight. She was disqualified because of weight. Tell me, how can law, sporting law particularly, appreciate difference in terms of biology, difference in terms of gender, a lot more? Have you thought about this?
Yeah, so it's actually the central theme of the book. Boundary Lab really is an exploration. And why is it called Boundary Lab? Because I believe that sport is sort of the largest social experiment that we're running, and one that is at a global scale. There are very few other things that are run at that scale, and I think the Olympics is at the very top of this structure, right? So whether you're playing at the district level, you're playing at the state level, you're all feeding into one large competition. And that is called the pyramid of sport. So the pyramid leads up, and the Olympics, the World Championships, the World Cups are really at the top of this pyramid, right? But what makes this unique, and when you talk about difference, is that the uniqueness of sport is that the rules of sport have to be the same throughout the world, right? So if you want this combined tournament leading up to a single, like that Olympic final, is the culmination of all these little tournaments. So whatever place in the world you're playing, you're actually leading into that. So you need common rules, common principles to know that this is really the outcome of a fair competition, right?
And people are not common. Each individual is unique.
Exactly. Each individual is unique, and sport is actually wants that. Sport doesn't want flatness, right?
Of course.
It's trying to find difference. But in the quest for difference, it also has some lack of tolerance for certain types of difference. Because what it's doing is that anomalies in the system, there's no room for anomaly.
Right.
There is, sport needs these very hard lines. And like, it could be, for example, on this issue of gender, right? There is a very clear gender binary. Now, everyone takes it as a given, right? There's male sport, there's female sport. But where does male sport end and where does female sport begin? And who polices that line? And that's where all the action is at, right? So 99% of the population is very clearly in one side
either
of
one
the,
of the
either
basket
one of the binary. But that's not 100%, right? So the reality is, when sport makes its rules, it needs the same rules for 100% of the participating population. But its rules are fair and reasonable to probably 99 point some decimal of those, right? So in the quest to find difference from commonality, and that's the whole issue of classification of sports, right? So the most common classification of sport is by male and female sport.
Yeah.
There are only 2 or 3 sports where actually everyone plays the same sport. For example, even at the Olympics, there's some sailing events, there's equestrian, which is both genders play the same sport. There are in fact some sports where it's science suggests that women do better, like rifle shooting, open water swimming, long distance swimming. But
so, you know, there's mixed gender sports, and it throws up its own set of interesting questions, and how it is a much larger playing arena in a sense. It creates a much larger playing arena, a more inclusive arena, in which if teams are comprised of different genders, then the question of who is which gender does not arise. And
yes and no. But at the same time, there's also this issue of what is your notion of fairness versus my notion of fairness. So protecting gender has its own elements of fairness, right? Protecting women's sport is one ism, if you want to call it, of fairness. However, inclusion is another ism. So who gets to decide who is male and who cannot participate in female categories? So that is the line at which, and who polices the line becomes the debate, right? But if you take a step back on why do we classify sport at all? Why do we have male-female sport? And then in many sports, we have by weight category, and that's clearly come out in the Vinesh case, right? You have 50 kgs, you have 53 kgs, and different classifications. So the role of classification is to be wide enough to show difference in skill, but narrow enough to show that people of reasonably similar competitive aptitude are participating against each other, right? So if you had a 70 kg wrestler compete against a 50 kg wrestler, you're always going to be biased towards the 70 kgs. Like, I mean, for example, like I said, I was 6 feet tall at age 13, and I was bowling to people who were probably 4 foot 11. So there was already a competitive advantage, and I had significant advantages at that age group. And later on, things caught up, and it was skill that then became more predominant, right? So there are some what you would call inherent capabilities that we have, and then we have acquired capabilities. So it's the inherent capabilities that you want some commonality on, so that the acquired capabilities of skill, the hard work that you can put in, those sport attempts to reward. So sport is theoretically respectful of differences. It's actually seeking differentiation. It's seeking who is able to use their aptitudes and skills, put in the effort. But at the same time, it is not accepting of certain types of difference. And that's where the politics of this all lies, right?
The reward for difference and the punishment.
Yes. So
you could say it that way. Because if we talk about the punishment for difference, now I was horrified by what my colleagues put out when they described what a woman's body has to go through in order to be relevant in wrestling. That there are these, they draw blood, I believe. I mean, there are these dehydrating procedures. How does someone compete? And the conditions are therefore not the same. I mean, you're talking about providing equal playing conditions for anybody who's playing the sport, which starts with the playing surface, the equipment and all of that. And, you know, everything, you tried as much to provide a standardized common this thing. But now here you have cheese for the goose is not cheese for the gander, which is that the male sports person is not having to go through all these hoops.
I mean, to be fair, in wrestling, everyone deals with it.
Okay.
And it's
but
not
the female body supposedly...
Yeah, but like everyone participating in the female wrestling event is dealing with the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so...
So as a class, if women are suffering because of this, do you think that... So, how do you work... Is there a law answer to this? Is there a way you can creatively interpret those little bylaws which govern that sport to say that, okay, in women's sport, we'll have some relaxation? Is that how it works? Do you see women itself pushing back against that?
So I think it's asking much larger questions of how far we will push the body for achievement, right? So I don't think there's a difference in the way weight categories should be policed for men and women. If you believe that weight categories are relevant in wrestling, boxing, weightlifting, and like essentially combat sports and strength-based sports, if you accept the binary, I mean the weight as a classifier, you have to police that line, whether it's 100 grams or 500 grams. at what point does the line start getting drawn, right? So sports fairness requires
But
zero.
how do you address this issue, which is that here is somebody saying I'm a woman, okay, and I'm not going to be able to, my body is not going to be able to meet these lines.
But the reality is that there are
hormonal changes that happen in my body.
In this Vinesh Fogart case,
Yeah.
her natural weight is at 54, 55, 56, 57.
Which
So
is,
she's being forced to do something unnatural to get to that weight category. That's where the rub lies. And I mean,
and if she were a 53, 54 kg man,
she might have also had to do that. But actually, the story here is something that's happened well before.
okay,
Which is that she wanted to compete in the 53 kg category. But she's had a huge run-in with the federation and taken on power, right?
yeah,
And when you take on power, your options reduce.
yeah,
So actually, another athlete has you can only send one athlete in each weight category, and someone else had already taken the 53 kg weight category. So it's only in February of 2024 that she has decided. So with just 6 months to go to the Olympics, that she has to drop a category.
Yeah.
I mean, the best of us know how difficult it is to lose 4 or 5 kgs. But imagine doing that when you're working towards the Olympics. So what happened on the days of the Olympic sort of qualifiers and the final is the product of a lot of things that have happened till then, right? So should she have been participating in the 50 kg category? The answer is probably no. Was that her first choice? The answer is no. But there have been a series of events that have got her to here, and the policing is not from the rules of sport. The policing is the outcome of certain interactions she's had with power and the consequences of that.
and the consequences of power and how it almost ruined her career and her life.
And you could argue has successfully.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because that is one area which your book, which you yourself as an activist, a sportsist, you called yourself.
Oh, I would call myself a sports advocate.
Advocate.
I'm a lawyer, but also I advocate for the role of sport in our society. So.
And you talk about how the sport is run, governed, how it's administered, and all of it. In my mind, to my mind, when I was reading your stuff, it came down to autonomy versus accountability. Autonomy versus accountability
of
sports bodies. Because here you have one principle, which is a very old principle of international sport.
Yes.
Which is that nations are complicated entities.
Correct.
And they are political beings.
Yes.
And sport somehow has to live over and above this.
So it has to transcend and be above, and sort of the primacy of sport has to take over the primacy of sort of local politics. And it's that same thing, right?
And
you're building this global commons.
Yeah.
And you don't want it to be disturbed by local disturbances, if you call it. So
you wanted to stay away from politics. You don't want it to be either part of the Soviet bloc or the capitalist West. You don't want it to be part of the Axis bloc or the Allied bloc. This is something that goes back to, it derives from some of the greatest conflicts in human history, which is that we do not want to be part of these political conflicts, and we want to have sport as a metaphor for a kind of conflict which is over and above bloodshed, but then it's still competitive and all of that, which is the reasoning behind autonomy. But when it comes to accountability, the same logic gets extended to saying that we will not be in any way answerable to governments of any land.
Yes.
Now, the governments, yes, they are political, but they're also a manifestation of people's opinion.
Correct.
They are representatives of people. And why is that relevant in a context like in India? Is because you have these sporting bodies who are actually not answerable to the law of the land in a sense. They're not answerable to parliament. The sports code in India never really got implemented. And I wonder why it is the sports code. You'll have to talk about that also, and why it's not the Sports Act.
Yes.
There was an attempt to codify it into law.
Many attempts. Yes.
Many attempts, which were, blocked by people. Blocked by people in that same parliament because they were also in governing bodies of these sports.
Correct.
And to have that kind of oversight over sporting bodies, which reduce their power, and because they have this conflict of interest by being both in legislature as well as in these sporting bodies, these measures never got implemented. So therefore, you have, in the name of autonomy, bodies such as the BCCI, you have the Indian Olympic Association, you have various sporting federations which are not answerable to the government.
And more importantly, one, not answerable to the government, but each of them is monopoly and monopsony. So if you want to...
Okay, so this is an important thing I want you to talk about. Firstly, in terms of definitions, monopoly and monopsony. these two terms, I mean, how it's different? Can you just...
Yeah, so monopoly is where there's only one seller, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to watch cricket, it's only BCCI recognized tournaments
That's
that
a
are on
Sony.
Buyer is monopsony, but seller is monopoly. Right?
Yeah.
So you're selling a product, there's only one place to go. So there's only one form of official cricket. You want to go and watch a match, it has to be recognized by the BCCI. You want to watch football, it has to be recognized by the Football Federation.
Yeah.
Monopsony is the buyer. So, for example, talent, if you need to move up the ladder of sport, there's only one authorized body that allows you to do that, right? So, it's both monopoly and monopsony, but it's also autonomous.
Right.
So, we don't generally regulate monopolies in that way, right? You say that you can take this whole slice of socio-economic life and you can do whatever you want with it in some sense. That's not the way we actually engage with what you would call monopolies and monopsonies are set up for market failures, of misuse, of excessive use of power, because there is no alternative to go to, right? So someone speaks up against a sports governing body. They don't need to even be banned. They just need to not be selected again, right? Yeah. So there is no other place they can go.
There's no court of appeals.
Yeah. So if Vinesh Fogart takes on the Wrestling Federation of India, there isn't a Wrestling Federation of India too saying, okay, I'll go and play for them. So that limits the type of engagement a Vinesh Fogart or an athlete can have with the primary body as well. So in some sense, in the commercial world, we have ways in which we deal with monopolies, monopsonies. We take them down, we dismantle them, we change the rules, we change supply chains. But in sport, we don't have that. And we multiply that by saying autonomous body, not accountable to government.
So here you have a situation in which you don't have a Wrestling Federation of India to go to. You also don't have a mechanism whereby you can go on appeal to the government or the Ministry of Sports saying that my federation...
See, theoretically you do, but in practical situations where we have got to, and there's a history to this, right? So Indian sport pre-independence was brought up on patronage. Lots of our Maharajas supported sport, gave some cricket bats and allowed you to go on tour. Some of them even played for India as a result of that, right? So it goes back to the, the analogy I often use is when we play on the street, the person who owns the bat gets to bat first, right? Yeah. And can decide when play ends. Yeah. Time to do homework, here I go. So that notion of being in power, lots of Indian cricketers have been Maharajas. As we moved from that to independent India, sport was not high priority, right? We were trying to build our institutions, educational institutions, scientific institutions. When we, there is a history to this of patronage of sport. You see a lot of sport in pre-independence India was supported by Maharajas and other people who, even the Tatas actually funded one of the early Indian Olympic contingents.
Right.
So there was a patronage-based model, like I talk about quite often in fondly when you play street cricket. It's the person who owns the bat who bats first and also decides when we come to the end of play, right? They want to take their bat home and that's the end of the cricket match. So a lot of the patronage-based models had people in power actually determining the course of how we played sport in some sense. But as we moved to independent India, our focus has changed. It was about educational institutions, science, that type of stuff. And I don't think sport populated a very important part in our priority list, right? You look at Maslow's hierarchy, there are essentials and necessaries that you try and build as a society. Sport took a sort of a backseat. It was sort of tolerated, it was supported through public sector units, people were given employment and livelihoods, but it was not central focus of our times, right? So you come to the 70s, you have a Prakash Padukone winning, so you have anomaly athletes who just break through just on their own terms and make it through. Yeah. And so there is a notion of competitive sport happening, but mostly by private action. Our federations have formed themselves, they're little sort of coterie-based things. My family runs one federation, your family runs another one. It's passed on from generation to generation. These are theoretically the autonomous federations and the private bodies. These are all non-profit bodies that have been set up many years ago. And they find some affiliations in all of the various different state bodies. Yeah. So you're suddenly in this powerful position. You go back to the history of lots of these bodies, no one knows how they got there actually. Yeah. And it's not like everyone gets a vote in national sports federations.
It is almost like the Constituent Assembly, right?
Yeah. How is it assembled? Who chose what? Is there actually truly representative democracy in this? The answer is obviously no. Yeah. But then you've built a smokescreen saying that this is a democracy of sport that is playing through. Theoretically, every single club playing sport feeds into the district association. District association feeds into state association, state into the national. But we know that's not true, right? So is the voice of sport in the governance of sport? The answer is quite obviously not. But in the legal sense, these are bodies that are all recognized by international sports bodies, then eventually have to be recognized by the government.
Actually, that international recognition that you spoke about and how that is also a nexus I discovered through your book. So you have a situation where the international bodies are very touchy about autonomy, saying that governments stay away from us, right? And what they do, and what the local body does, which is what the Football Federation did, which is what the Olympic Association in India did, is that when the government tried to regulate them, they in fact, even the BCCI, right, when Anurag Thakur was the head of the BCCI, when the government tried to, when the Supreme Court tried to interfere, he goes behind their back and alerts the international body saying that my government is interfering. So the international body threatens to de-recognize the Indian body, and that scares the Indian government, saying, "Hey, on an international stage, we will, look foolish because our team will be disqualified."
And who suffers is the athletes. So this is happening sport after sport,
also
right?
The country sees it as a loss of prestige if they are not.
So the threat is held over sort of national pride and
exactly. So the disqualification of a body is the threat that keeps the government of the land from interfering in how it is run. And
so this actually leads to a very interesting situation. So if the government doesn't regulate, theoretically while there's autonomy, there's also a vertical recognition process. So the international body should be actually policing the national body, right? So there's an accountability. So if you're regulated by no one, we're in a problem situation. But if you're also inadequately regulated within the structure, you have a different problem. Now, how are international bodies set up? They are actually membership bodies voted to power by national sports federations. Now, imagine a situation where the person you're voting, who has voted for you, is the one you have to hold accountable. There's a break in incentive structure, right? So if you've come to power based on the votes of 60 out of 90 national sports federations, are you going to hold those 60 accountable? You want to be elected again, right? So similar to our electoral democracy, what is the first objective of governance is to seek re-election. The second is to actually govern, right? So which is why successive governments have tried to now bring legal frameworks in place to say, hey, you might be private and you might be autonomous, but that isn't necessarily divorced from accountability in a public sense. You're actually taking the slice of life, right? Monopoly, monopsony, socio-economic, political, economy. We recognize you're it. So it's not like we're going to replace you. But if you're occupying this space, do it in a way that is publicly accountable, because you've actually taken a whole aspect of life and you've taken power over that.
Yeah, because public accountability, now look at what happened with the BCCI and the Supreme Court. Now it's a stalemate. So what happens is you have the Supreme Court, I don't know, some would say acting like a cricket fan, trying to reform cricket, because a lot of cricket fans in India have been frustrated primarily by how it is run. The game is run. So here's the Supreme Court, a bunch of judges come and, really take it upon themselves to reform cricket. The Lodha Commission is appointed. It gives these recommendations, which initially the court tries to impose, and the BCCI just turns into water, which is, if you try to punch air or water, it just disperses, right? You cannot find the target. It just becomes this fungible creature and just stops responding to the summons of the court. It's almost like non-compliance, which later led the court to realize there is no way we can govern this. And then there was a kind of a stalemate where the Supreme Court also was left with a bloody nose. And it right now is in a situation where both are just in a standoff.
Yeah, so this has happened sport after sport, right? You name the sports federation, almost everyone, the judiciary has now intervened. And so we talked about market failure, but there's also been a governance failure, which is because we talked earlier about patronage, and that patronage model ended up in lots of our politicians occupying space in sports bodies across the board. Because when you have scarce commodities, you need power to even access them, right?
Yeah.
So what's the best way to access is to bring someone into your house and sort of claim from there. And that's how sports bodies started aligning with power, because in limited resource settings, power can access that limited resource at the cost of other federations, other causes, other needs. So you had people of political power or close to political power occupying bodies. So even the government, so when you look at the wings of government, right, you have legislature, executive and judiciary. Neither the legislature nor executive had any desire to actually intervene. There were attempts by multiple governments to bring in a Sports Development Act, eventually ended up just as a code, which is an administrative instruction, which hasn't necessarily over the last 12, 13 years either been updated or been enforced strictly. So in theory, we have a accountability framework, but the lack of legislative and executive action meant that it was incumbent on at least the third wing of government, that is the judiciary, to intervene, right? So it was not like the judiciary was waiting to jump in and everyone's a sports fan and let me tell you who to select and how to run your team. But it was almost left with the baby. There's a baby crying out loud for attention. That is all of sport. And if you're not going to deal with it in the legislative sense or the executive sense, it has come down to the judiciary. Now, everyone's complaining, why does the judiciary want to intervene and other things like that. But I think from all of this line of cases, one of the most important principles that has come out is that while these are private bodies, and there's a recognition there's private bodies for a good reason, autonomy, they exercise a public function. So the accountability to the public has now been established in law unambiguously. There's been a line of cases, but this recent 5-6 years has actually changed the face of the way we have to look at sports governance and the place it occupies in our public domain. Because it places sports governors as trustees, not as owners of what they run. And there's a very important difference, and that I hope will play out in the years to come.
I take your point that principle has now gained currency. The principle of accountability, that you're a public body. Now, finally, there was a time when Virat Kohli played for BCCI.
That was the argument made.
That was the argument made. That was the principle. The principle was that Virat Kohli,
private body.
It's a private body. This player is playing for that private body, not for India.
And that as a result of that, the private body is only accountable to its own members. The public doesn't have a voice or say or any claim on it.
And now, in a notional sense, that principle has changed. But in practice, if you still look at it, what was the main objection? When you talked about autonomy, you're essentially talking about do not interfere in how my bodies are structured, who is part of my body. A lot of the focus of the Supreme Court was on things such as term and tenure, which is how long should the president's term be, vice president's term be, all the office bearers. How many terms do they get? How long should the tenure be? Who can be a contestant? The concept of the conflict of interest, which is that you cannot be, let's say, a bat manufacturing company owner as well as be
on the technical committee deciding which balls get used.
You cannot be running a private coaching institution which has and be a selector. All of these conflicts of interest kind of situations are what they sought to prevent, and that is an area in which there is now no change, right? That is what the Supreme Court and the BCCI, for example, have now. The standoff is that. See that the BCCI, after all of this, the COA was appointed, and a body by the Supreme Court was appointed, and now that is gone and it's back to square one, where they get to still choose those hegemons, people who are second generation, third generation cricket administrators and not players. They've never held a bat, but they're doing that. But you said somewhere in your book that in spite of all of this, it is while cricket might have not seen the kind of reform that is desirable, other sports have had a positive turnaround as a result of the Supreme Court BCCI tussle. You mentioned judo, equestrian sports.
So pretty much all sports, they're all in actually court right now. So voices that were never expressed now have
the football is in court.
Principle to hang your hat on, right? This notion of the public function. What does it mean when you're exercising a public function? It means that me as an individual outside, I'm not a member, but I'm affected by your decision. I have the ability to go to a court, writ jurisdiction. I can claim the fundamental right to access remedies if something is I've been discriminated against, if there's arbitrary behavior. There's limited spaces in which you can challenge a sports body, but there are spaces. So what's happened is, you could call it the Overton window has shifted, right? It's legitimate to make claims on a sports body as an individual who is actually outside the membership.
Right.
And that is, to me, a significant shift. And what are the courts doing now? They're asking much more difficult questions. So the courts also pushing the needle in. They haven't done it, and I think the BCCI reform was incomplete for various different reasons. But in all of the other bodies, now what they're trying to build is an accountability down the pyramid. So far, what has happened is, due to our constitutional structure, sport is a state subject. So the central, the union government actually can only regulate national sports federations in theory and send Indian teams. The sports is not even a concurrent list subject. So it's the Indian government, the union government, is actually in only regulatory capacity with national teams. So what happened is that it had the power and authority only to actually bring any sort of accountability, theoretical accountability, to our national sports federations. So the sports code has only applied to national sports federations. But the judiciary has now pushed, saying, why do not those principles not have a waterfall effect to state sports federations, to district sports federations? So they're asking now much more difficult questions of what is sports democracy. So where are you deriving your power from? If you claim you're the president of XYZ federation, who has given you the legitimacy to get there? What is the way in which you bubbled up through election?
And that, correct me if I'm wrong, as a lawyer, is a process of creating people to whom you are responsible, creating stakeholders.
Yes.
Right? And creating stakeholders as perhaps even juristic persons.
Yes.
Which can translate into that you're a sports body. If you have 100,000 people turning up for a tournament or for a match at your venue, which you are, the KSCA, then as a stakeholder, the spectator becomes a stakeholder, means that a spectator is also a juristic person, means that they can litigate.
Yes. So standings.
What locus standi do you have?
Locus standi to actually make a claim. So actually, I mean, my book talks about it. In South America, there's actually fan rights statutes.
There you go.
Where you have the right to information about a match before it's happened. You have a right to know where tickets are being sold, access to sort of flat opportunities to participate in sport. If your rights are trampled upon, you have a remedy, you have a grievance redressal and ombudsman place to go to. So that is also evolved, and the actually Lodha Commission tried to do that as well, to bring fans into the mix of recognized legal stakeholders. So in theory, there is a way that if you have a bad experience at a stadium, you have a right to actually go to what is called the BCCI ombudsman and to make a complaint, and they're supposed to respond. So in theory, lots of this stuff has started happening.
So it's not just a spectator experience; it's also player. Could it be also player treatment?
Could be player treatment. So there have been attempts to set up what is called the Indian Cricketers Association, which is a association of cricketers. But again, that was incomplete. They only included retired cricketers in that. So it became almost like a pension scheme and medical insurance type of structure, but not for advocacy for rights of players who are within the bodies. And I think football has sort of a players association, but there are very few others. So, but the movements, and this is not a static thing, right? So sports bodies are also recognizing, and they smell the coffee of the pushback they're getting from governments. So there's actually reform at international scales of getting more athletes into governance. So you have athletes commissions. You have elections by athletes of recently retired athletes who come and speak on behalf of the athletes. I mean, at this point, they're still asked to stay in their lane. They're not brought into mainstream governance. They're athletes' representatives, and they're supposed to speak only about what theoretically affects athletes. In my view, anything to do with governance affects athletes. But they're asked, I mean, there is a gradual recognition. And this actually is a larger question about how change happens, right? Does it happen all at once, or does it happen in iterative ways? There is no right answer to that. But we're seeing
what we know about change is that once the process of change is set off, it has a kind of a ripple effect, and that you think has happened with this Supreme Court.
That has happened in broader world of sport.
In the world of sport, not just in India.
I mean, in the Indian, let's say the world of Indian sport, but there is rippling effects across jurisdictions as well, right? So I don't think anyone in the world of sport can ignore India any longer. Just the power of our spectatorship, the power of the future demographic that we have. It is the largest and most important player in the next stage of development of global sport. So what happens in Indian sport is actually relevant to all of global sport.
Right. I mean, there's so much I wanted to discuss in terms of administration, but I see that, there's a lot of time we have spent on that. I want to move to another segment, to look at now, we are looking at sporting bodies. So obviously we're looking at competitive sport.
Yes.
And the moment competition and the result becomes a matter of public interest, right? Then this becomes a public body. And therefore, that is the entire concept of how it is a matter of public interest. Another way, if you take the competition away from the sport as a public good, right? Sport not necessarily as an activity which will bring laurels to the country. Sport as an activity which is good for the development of a human being, the development of a community,
yes.
Mental health, all of these things. How do you create the new woman and the new man? The nation building project,
yes.
And how is sport a part of that? And when you talk about sport as a public good, can you imagine it in terms of as an extension of roti kapda makan, and sport as an essential public good that the government is supposed to distribute? That the government is supposed to distribute this public good. You have a ration shop to distribute subsidized grain. Is it possible to subsidize sport? And that is the only way you're going to have everybody playing sport in a country like India, right? When you talk about sport for all, I see a lot of people who are making an intervention in the area of sport who are very invested in this question of sport for all.
Yes.
And how do we start imagining this concept of sport for all? How can we make it a public good? And I do have a legal question for you to solve, which is very close to home for me. Because, how we play the sport is defined by where we play the sport. I'll come to that. I'll have this legal question for you. But first, your imagination of sport as a public good.
Yes. So, I think it's a great question. And it actually hits at the root of what we consider to be sport itself. And what is meaningful sport.
Because sport is imagined as a champion factory. That exactly. The nation's duty is to create champions.
So, outcomes are always seen as medals, right?
Yeah.
So, when someone is playing as a young person, even our notion of what grassroots sports is, this notion of grassroots sports is suggesting that something at the bottom is
there are bigger clubs, so there should be smaller clubs.
And it's grassroots sports is in the service of elite sport. The role of grassroots sport is to find talent and then to take it to the top.
Which means a C division club is a feeder for an A division club.
The only reason it's a C division club is because it wants to be an A division club. And that A division club wants to be in national championship. National championship wants to be in the Asian championship. So that notion of constantly wanting to be bigger and better and eventually excel, don't get me wrong, there's a very important role for elite sport in the broader setup. But is it the end of sport? Absolutely not. And this is a notion that plays out everywhere, right from school levels, right? So there's a PE period, but there's also sport. What is your notion of sport in a school? It's whoever represents the school team.
Exactly.
Now, when you talk about sports for all, sport is about building a relationship with your body, expression, interaction, building community, understanding yourself, understanding difference. And do we use it as a tool? I don't think so. If you're good at sport, hey, go to the school sports team. If you're not so good and you don't show early aptitudes, go and join the literary club or go and...
The same doesn't apply to a mathematics or this thing.
Yeah, so when you look at numeracy and literacy, they are understandings as basic building blocks of a good life.
Yeah.
But that notion of physical literacy, of understanding your body, building the motivation to use it, to live a long and active life, whether you play sport or not, you get on, but the ultimate off ramp from any level of sport, whether you play it in school, in the lunch break, whether you play it at home in the evenings, whether you play it at club level, national level, ultimately we're trying to all build healthy lives, right?
Yeah.
Physically healthy, mentally healthy, spiritually healthy lives. And sport has all of these off ramps, but are we oriented towards giving sport a chance in these ways at individual, community and national levels? I don't think we've done a particularly good job. And part of it comes from this imposition of elite sport, of performance, of competition, being the best among 1.4 billion, the evangelization of celebrityhood and productization of sport. And it is a role at the top of the pyramid. But when that becomes the exclusive language of sport, I think we run into some difficulties where there is a strong dissonance between some people's concept of sport and other people's. And placing it as organized sport, to me, I see it as a club good where it's a few playing on behalf of all of us.
Yeah.
So conceptually, we all have the ability to play and join this pyramid, and anyone can be a footballer, right? If you wanted to be, you just have not had the motivation, would be the argument. I would argue you may not have even had the opportunity, but your 11 that play on the field as the Indian national football team are playing on behalf of all of us. So there's only 11 spots there. But sport is not naturally that. Sport is, anyone should have the right and ability to play. So can you also have sport as public good, which is accessible? There's a recognition that there are again market failures in public goods, that power will in some sense ensure that it is sort of accessed by a few at the cost of others. So you need both, I would say, governmental and private interventions to make sport accessible, both commercially, but also in other ways in terms of access.
And from the point of view of a child, you know, the loveliest sight in the world, I suppose, for anybody, any human being, is to see a child monkeying around, right?
Absolutely.
To lose the ability to be a monkey.
Tinkering,
right?
absolutely.
To jump and to scream and to shout and to, you know, twist your body into a million postures, you know, that is very much part of getting to know yourself.
Yes.
And, you know, a monkey also needs a forest. And access to sport also often means, sports for all also often means access to sporting arenas.
Yes.
Right? Where are our sporting arenas? So if I wanted to be a cricketer, the first thing I need is a cricket net. Right? I need either a cement surface and or a turf surface, a mat, an entire arena to play this thing. And the only place which has an arena is a paid arena. You can pay by the hour, join an academy. There is no way for me to access the sport, and this is very different from how you know, some of the sporting nations see sport. I have noticed that, you know, so we have heard these horror stories about segregation in America, right? When I go to the US, I see that even the black neighborhoods over there, the most deprived neighborhoods, have enough and more sporting arenas. There is a stadium in every neighborhood over there. There's a basketball court. There's a area where you can run around. Our thing literally is about not having these arenas, you know, sports access to commons, right? Like the playground is a common good, is a public good, but not everybody can play in that playground.
Yes, because there's only so many you can use it.
Yeah.
So I think it asks much larger questions on this club good versus public good.
Public
right?
good. So tell me about public commons and open spaces and playgrounds. Can we think of, you're a lawyer. My question to you, the legal question was, a child's right to play, can it be extended, the imagination be extended to say a child's right to access a playing arena, saying that you cannot under any circumstances deny a person of a certain age category from accessing a sporting arena, just like you cannot prevent a person from accessing a water body, right? Like water is commons, a forest is commons, a hill, a beautiful natural resource is commons, a sporting arena is commons. How do you build law around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very difficult one to answer, because on the other side of any right is an obligation.
Right.
Right? There is no right without obligation. Someone has to, in some sense, pony up on the other side. Is it practical to expect state to deliver all of that to every single human being? I mean, I think we live in a country with limited and scarce resources. Sometimes creation of very hard rights structures actually reinforces power. So the people who, again, without the access to converting those rights into meaningful open spaces for everyone, which actually have space for everyone, what ends up happening is they perpetuate the people who can claim those rights, starting to use limited resources. In an unlimited resource environment, of course, you can say there must be space for all.
Monopolization. So you have people, you know, who have access are essentially people from a certain strata.
Yes.
Who gain access and then wallet in.
Yes. So
right?
actually,
in a city like Bangalore,
and it's absolutely the issue of when you look at organized sport, it is getting more and more, already is permission based.
Yeah.
So you can play only if you have someone's permission.
Yeah.
It starts from the parent. You don't even have space outside your home to play. I mean, lots of our sport happened on the street, in open spaces. Now, your parent has to drive you to a football academy or a cricket academy, or, I mean, you take an auto and go. But there are different ways. But without the autonomy of the child, you actually dropped an entire aspect of tinkering, of pick up sports, create new sports out of limited resources. Forget about arenas. We don't even have space.
So the space thing. So we talked about civic amenities sites in town planning, in any urban space. There is a concept of a CA site, a civic amenities site, which means every neighborhood needs to have its playground, and that playground cannot be accessed by anyone privately.
But they're all theoretically there. They're locked up between 10 and 5 p.m. and there's a security guard with a lock and key. So again, this becomes a permission-based
system. So how do you litigate
system
against something like that?
So I think it's time to really think through town planning, urban infrastructure, maybe even open up tops of buildings. What I would love to see much more is multi-use facilities where it's just a surface and people get to choose what they play. Now, who am I to decide someone should play football? And the minute you build structure and you put 2 goals and you can play only one sport, you've actually taken away the autonomy of the user. So you've actually overlaid a structure when maybe structure was not required. All you needed was space. And take it back to the childhood concept, right? Children need a few implements and space. They figured out how to make games. And I'd like to take it back to even one more element, which is what is the role of play particularly in early childhood and interaction. And this is something as a lawyer I really reflect on, is that our notions of rules, justice, fairness, actually the first interaction we have with them is in the role of play. So sharing toys, playing a game, you'll have a sibling complaining about another sibling. So you're actually building your notions of justice from free play and then from slightly more organized play. And when you take that out to a broader society, it's the same thing. That are on the edges, our notions of fairness, justice, what is right, what is wrong. Sport is actually playing a very significant pioneering role. Because not all of us go to courts, not all of us litigate, but all of us can see that unfairness of competition, the lines being drawn where they shouldn't be drawn. So the role of sport in the concept of fairness and our understanding of fairness, even concepts of meritocracy, what is privilege, are very, very key role players. And then when you look at sort of that from the context of organized sport versus disorganized sport, when you build permission to a structure, people enter based on someone else's acceptance of you inside the club.
And that someone else is who?
It could be a sports governing body. It could be a club secretary saying, I'll select you or I won't. And there you see the distinct difference in the evolution of what you would call hardball cricket and tennis ball cricket. Tennis ball cricket can be played anywhere. 2 of us can sort of step out here and play. It doesn't have the structure. All it needs is 6 feet of space, even a stick and some round implement.
So these permissions that you speak of course, I mean, a lot of what you said was focused on clubs, on people who run institutions. I am not, they are people who run private institutions. These are training academies, a separate category. I'm talking about the RWA uncle.
I'm talking about permission of multiple sorts.
So you have an apartment complex, okay, or you have a gated community, which suddenly over time came and created a gate.
Correct.
In a place where there used to be open access for the kids of a catchment area of 5 kilometers.
So it's a commons converted to a private space.
That is not legal.
No, it's not.
It's not legal.
Absolutely.
Okay. Then you have, so there is one such category. Then you have these public sector. That for me, that is like a really big heartburn, because I come from East Bangalore, where you have all these public sector undertakings, HAL, NAL, BEML, ISRO. You have the Air Force establishments, the residential establishments, not the defense establishments. Now, in the 90s, suddenly this regime of internal security, this whole conversation became huge, threat perceptions, infiltration, terrorism and all of these things led to residential colonies belonging to an ISRO, NAL or whatever being designated as, under threat and therefore locked up. Right now, you have a situation where a public sector undertaking has zero responsibility towards the neighborhood in which it is located. There is an NAL, or outside NAL are thousands of people, some of whom are actually working as casual labor in NAL, whose children are not able to play in the NAL ground. Now, is that a justiciable issue? Is that a public interest issue? Is this something that as a lawyer you would take up as a public interest issue?
No, I mean, I can't say I've thought about it, but it's very much part of the theme of my book, my work, which is actually what I call the privatization of the public commons.
Grounds.
And it's one of the aspects.
Let's talk grounds. Like, how do we take land back? Because if you don't have space, sport is
it's a fundamental building block
of sport, which is access to space. And in a society like India, if America is segregated by race, India is segregated by caste, right? In a segregated society where you want people, where somebody is literally crying out for a patch of the sky and a patch of the earth, you know, saying, I just want to breathe. And you're saying, no, you come from a certain neighborhood, you have no access to this playing this thing. Whereas by law, this is a CA site. This is a civic amenity site, which means everybody should have access. How do you litigate? How do you build an agenda around these things?
No, it's, I can't say I've thought about it, but certainly worth looking at much more deeply as a sort of a public interest issue of just opening up spaces, because I think the default in the way we engage with public life, public goods, is to see how to privatize them, including infrastructure, but also these roles, right? And we go back to governance. It could be RWA governance, it could be sports governance. You're in there to perpetuate your own interests. You're not going in there to promote the public spiritedness. And by own interest, I mean it could be you as an individual, or even your small community. When you're talking about this gated community, is that gated community thinking outside its walls? Absolutely not. Right? Is it a unit in and of itself? That's what it thinks of. It's actually built to insulate from lots of these issues.
And it is in violation of law. First and foremost, the impunity. Now, let me trap you a little bit over here. So a lot of my friends, you know, we are all a sporting community. We go watch sport, and not just cricket, because we can't, of course, afford the tickets, forget it. But we try and watch sport, we play sport, we engage with sporting communities at a local level. You know, like for example, I don't know if you know of the lawyer Clifton Rosario. You know, he plays football, but he wants to engage with football in a 1 hour pet, in an EG Pura. You know, how does football get played and things like that. And one of the things, I suppose, if I put this out as a lawyer, you know, would you consider taking up a litigation? You know, is this something that you would do for a Bangalore kind of a city, where if someone came to you and said, Nandan, can we go to the High Court against an RWA which is not allowing us to use a public ground?
I can't say I've thought about that, and like I said, I don't necessarily.
Will you take the brief? Is it a brief that is takeable? You think you can take it to the High Court? You think they'll throw it out?
I mean, I think you will have to. What you're trying to enforce is law of sort of the BBMP, right? I mean, why not? I can't say I've thought about it. I don't litigate personally, but
you're part of law firms. You advise.
Yeah, I mean, I work more on the sort of the sports side of things. You will be sort of, I would say, redrawing lots of Bangalore, and it's certainly an opportunity.
And it will have a ripple effect on other cities. It becomes precedence, right?
But again, like, this is not that different from that sports code and the bodies, right? So you have the law, but why is it not being enforced? How have you allowed these to be locked up as private spaces? It's because the power is essentially inside these bodies and also on the other side, right, of administration. You've actually captured what I would call regulatory capture in some sense. The people who are supposed to hold you accountable on behalf of the public actually have no incentive or motivation to sort of unlock those gates, remove the boundary walls, and then you're going to the judiciary to play a very similar role than what they've played in sport, which is, hey, the legislative structure is in place, but the executive is not necessarily, in some sense, complying with law. So now judiciary, the last bastion of justice, can you restructure this power game, right? So the large builders of Bangalore, are they going to open up their play fields and allow people, and I use the term allow very actively.
Who are you to allow? It's such a frustrating thing to even conceive of. Who is that uncle?
Because you own it, right?
Yeah.
So as public commons. Yeah. And I don't think we're actually that familiar with this concept of a public commons, which actually everyone has rights and access to. But there's also
a river doesn't belong to anybody. The sky doesn't belong to anybody.
But what is first motivation? If you get access to a public space, is to, in some sense, make it yours. Right? And this is the book. My book is actually about sport as metaphor for a public commons. And the question of how do we want to engage with it as private individuals, stepping into a public commons, our life takes a little bit of a public hue. Do we think rationally from a individualistic perspective, or is there a sort of a public spiritedness that needs to come in our engagement of the public commons? So the commons is also something that is capable of depletion, right? It's for everyone. But if everyone privatizes, there's nothing left for anyone. So what is our engagement with sport? What is our engagement with space? Do we leave it better than we found it, or at least no worse than we found it? I'm not sure we think like that in institution building. It's about putting yourself in a position where you can take a piece of that pie by exclusion. But public commons are actually non-excludable, non-rival in definition. But we've been very successful in converting public goods into private goods. And I would say space is certainly one of them. There are any number of excuses. I think in the public establishment sense, you've used the example of security or national interest. Easiest ones to play out, right? And down the line, there is so many different implications for that in terms of who gets to access, who gets to play. And it's not even like all of those are being used actively. There are lots of empty playgrounds.
That's the most painful sight, isn't it? When you see either people who are not in the sporting age category using those facilities, you know, or those facilities lying fallow.
And what's also happened, the ripple effect of that is the clubization of sport. Which is now people get together, pool money, pool membership fees, and set up tennis court, squash court, 2 or 3 other things. And there again, it's the person who's paid to access it who gets access. Kids are not playing, community around doesn't get to play. That land is possibly given at some discount because it's community development and club. I mean, we see clubs all over, right? We see clubs in any neighborhood you go to.
Private clubs that pretend to be a public function.
Public function. But I mean, you go in to become a member, you have to get approval of 10 other members. So anyone can object. So it's policed gates. It's not like a service where you pay the amount and you get in and you can get to play. And I think other countries have really figured out open spaces, public playgrounds. Where even if you have to pay and play, it's actually neutral access. So, I mean, even payment is a permission-based environment. There's a cost to even access. But even if I'm willing to pay, is someone standing there saying, no, you're not good enough. We're going to stop you from playing. And I think the whole of community approach is the one we probably need to take, looking at urban design, but also education of what is the education and our relationship with sport that is established very early. How do we live our lives in terms of our commute, workplaces, our workplaces encouraging active living, integration of sport? What about colleges? I mean, we see so much drop off in physical activity the minute someone is 16, 17, 18, at the point at which you should be taking off. And you see, once you drop off from sport and physical activity, it really takes something to come back to it. I mean, again, you probably need to do it when you have access to privilege. It's like someone joins a golf club at age 40 because they can buy in, right? Which they haven't played any sport for the last 20 years. And again, that's not just for sport. It's about buying into that club. And I'm a peer of these people. I do business. And so it's about, again, differentiating yourself and saying, I stand above. I mean, a very interesting book by Prashant Kidambi, one of my friends, it's called Cricket Country. So the first Indian cricket team, it had Palwanka, Balu and various others. But it also talked about how lots of communities used sport for what they called social distancing. So actually to show that they were closer to the British. So you were more anglicized than the common person. So sport has been used in many, you could argue, not so good ways as well, right? Saying, hey, I'm above this. I'm playing golf. I'm no longer just one of the proletariat or a common person. So sport, I mean, has all of these hues. The question is, as a society, which are the ones we want to use? And I mean, for me, the thing that drives me is I got so much out of sport as a young person. Identity, opportunity, confidence, friendships. My belief is that if it makes such a difference to one person, it can actually, the cascading effect. But to me, a large part of it is what you talk about is autonomy. I chose what sports I wanted to play. No one came and told me, hey, here's a cricket bat, become a cricketer. It was just there before me. I played on the street. I found my relationship with sport. Rather than sort of forced relationships and forced concepts of what is a meaningful engagement with sport, can we start with the unit of autonomy of individuals, autonomy of communities, and not imposition of, hey, everyone must play sports, so here's some equipment, here's some space, now I'm going to monitor how much you play and become a good person playing sport. So we have to have a sort of a flip model of I would say enablement rather than I'll give you access and then that's my bit for you.
So Nandan, this noise is keeping us from doing this interview. Let's try and walk and conclude this interview. I have one more question for you. We talked about access from the point of view of gender. How do different genders access the sport? We talked about access in terms of space. Who has access to an arena?
Yeah.
And the other barrier in India to every kind of access is definitely your caste location, your identity or your religious identity for that matter. We don't have as many Muslims as we would like to see in sport. We don't have as many, let's say, people from the northeast who we would like to see in sport. And of course, we don't have as many Dalits and Adivasis and lower caste people as we would like to see in sport. And the one example that a lot of people who are invested in the social question in sport, people like you, people like Sharda Ugra, talk about South Africa as an example. You know, it's become an example for a lot of people, saying here is a country which was banned from international sport because of how it treated its minorities. Its majority, its black population, and here now it is setting an example for the rest of the world, and it is asking questions of countries which have its own forms of segregation, like in South Asia or particularly in India. So, I mean, the straight up question is, how do you look at quota in sport, and how do you think creating affirmative action policies, you know, how do you think it will play out in India? We saw the Supreme Court judgment on internal reservation and how it completely, divided society, creamy layer and all these things. In sport, how do you see this playing out?
So I put a slightly different framework on this in some sense, and I look at progression in sport as a ladder. So in order to actually start playing sport, you have to get on and you want to progress at sport. And here we're talking very explicitly about representing the country, organized sport, elite sport, right? So it's not just about access to sport. It's who are we sending out as our national teams, who is participating on our behalf at the Olympics, at other events. So when you look at sport, first what you have is essentially the opportunity to sample sport. From sampling comes the opportunity to train at sport. From training, it comes the ability to compete, the ability to get better, and the ability to really push yourself, get access to resources, and then become, in some sense, an elite performer. So look at this in some sense as a ladder with various rungs on the ladder, right? So we want a representative team, and I think everyone is on board that we want the best representative team in the country. What is representative? Is there a meritocratic element? You want the person on the top of the ladder to be representing you and winning, right? So the role of elite sport is winning. Yeah. So you want to put your best possible team on the top of the ladder. But what are we living with is that many of the rungs of this ladder are actually broken. And very often when you talk about space to play, even just access to coaches, it's very low rungs of the ladder that are broken. Right. So how do you even get onto the ladder is one question. But then even if you have got on, how do you progress in the ladder? So if you look at our success so far, we've had anecdotal successes. We've had a few people break through, and it could be some from different castes and classes. We use them and these anecdotal successes.
If they could make it, why
if they can make it, see our system's working.
Yeah.
But actually there is the anomaly and the flaw. We say, oh, Riksha Pullar's daughter is captain of India's hockey team. We love those stories of, look, even that person has made it, and theoretically a meritocratic society. But in all of these, we do not recognize that the pathway is clearly broken. Each of these people who have made it to the top rung of the ladder has accessed some form of privilege along the way. Yeah. Either someone has sat and pushed them to the next rung of the ladder, so the broken one or two rungs has not really made a difference to them. But it has been based on some access to some form of privilege.
Magical element.
Yes. So they're not anecdotal successes produced by the system. It is anecdotal.
Despite the system.
But not even despite. There is people within the system who have been able to make them an exceptional person rise, right? It could be coming through competition. Some talent scout has found them. Some selector has seen something and given them pardon the use of given them that opportunity, is that it may not have naturally happened if that intervention hadn't taken place. But there from that, we say, hey, this person, look at them, they've made it to the national team. So we stop asking questions at the bottom, right? We stop asking questions, are these rungs of the ladder actually in place? So what should we be doing? We should be actually building the rungs in this ladder, not necessarily saying, hey, let's make sure as many people as possible in a representative way are right at the top of the ladder.
They have to be in different levels of the ladder in order for some of them to rise to the...
I mean, if you're not even starting.
Yeah.
And that's actually dealt with in the South African model is actually from the national team right down the system. You have to have a certain quota of black and colored players. I mean, lots of interesting questions. As an example, you brought that up. Should your international team be representative in that way? Or should you have a 20-year plan building rungs of the
South
ladder?
Africa had actually.
Yes.
You know, it has been experimenting with this for quite some time. Now, if you can, I don't know if we'll have time for this, but if you can just quickly tell me, how does the South African government manage to be so influential that it can, you know, affect the policy of its cricket board? If in India, you have a Supreme Court appointed committee which could not bring in basic reforms in terms of who gets to be an office bearer, what should be the tenure term be and all of that, where you have the body crying foul and running to the international body saying that this is an example of government's interfering in the autonomy of the thing.
It's actually a great question, because
how do you...
It's something I have also...
How did the South Africa board pull it off?
So they actually have a law that forces this.
Yeah.
So many would argue that is government interference in sports affairs. So in reality, cricket has not really navigated this pushback of, hey, there are countries in some sense running sports bodies. You've seen like Pakistan, pretty much the president of Pakistan has chosen the selectors. Sri Lanka, you've had that many cases. Yeah. So actually, cricket, you would argue, is the least protected. The autonomy of boards are least protected. Because also the way cricket is governed, it's the membership body is populated by its members. I don't think those lines of interference versus autonomy are policed so strongly. I don't think South Africa has been able to do that across all of its sports. Cricket is one of the sort of examples used, and they probably used that opportunity because the regulatory opportunity was there as well. But it's a great question, because we have to start asking and grappling with questions of at under 13 level, at under 16 level. Should we be asking much deeper questions? The answer is yes. Because if you don't build the pathways, you don't build that ladder, you're always going to have some form of inevitability that the products in the system are just the products of the system. You're not having a system that questions itself, has porous edges, gives people ways in. The anomaly actually doesn't become used as the sort of the evangelization of this is the norm. Genuine sort of flatness of each stage of the pyramid, because at the end of the day, talent doesn't choose caste, religion. It lands in any home that it chooses, right? And there is inherent talent in so many of us. Have we accessed all of it? I don't think by a distance. So we're still grappling with people who have bubbled up by their own means or accessing means that they had access to, but we are not produced talent from a systemic way where if the talent exists, success is inevitable. And that's the definition. I mean, it's almost a idealistic way of looking at it. Is if there's talent within the country, how can we make that an inevitable success, right? Right now, we don't even know where the talent resides. There is talent that is not accessing opportunities. Today, we have a national champion at, let's say, 100 meters. That is the fastest person who has participated in sport. Is that the fastest Indian? We have no clue. Because it's a slice of India that is in competitive sport, in accessing the public commons of sport. There's a huge sort of base of India which is never even running in an open space 100 meters long.
And if you look at that aspect of sport, you understand that so much of sport is outside the scope of activity of a board of control for cricket in India.
Absolutely.
Of an Indian Olympic Association. And therefore, what started off as perhaps a beautiful idea, which is to keep sport out of politics, perhaps lost sight of the fact along the way somewhere that politics can also be a vehicle for change, for positive change, and politics sometimes is a reflection of people's aspiration, and that governments are representatives of people. Nandan, I wish we could get deeper into this, and I hope that we can have you here once again and to discuss these
I love
topics.
chatting about these things. And
Thank you. Thank you. But we'll have to leave it here. Thank you so much for being on this show on What's Your Ism. That's all we have time for on this episode of What's Your Ism. As you can see now, we are trying to find a space which is quieter so that we can finish this recording. We are working under great constraints. Obviously, we would love to have a studio, and if you can play some role in helping us achieve that target, having our own space, please subscribe, please contribute to the TNM and NL, the fundraising activities that we are doing to keep our journalism sustainable. Thank you so much for watching. See you once again in the next episode of What's Your Ism.